we move on to the next session. We move beyond the back to the neck and beyond the simple degenerative back pain to a number of other pathologies. To moderate this session along with me, I would like to invite the Honorary Secretary General of the Indian Medical Association, Dr. Jayant Lele, who is himself a family physician practicing in Borivali in Bombay. Welcome, Dr. Lele, to
Hello,
the
sir.
program.
Thank you. Thank you.
And without wasting much more time, I would like to invite the first speaker, and that is Dr. Amol Rege, who is a senior spine consultant at the Dinanath Mangeshkar Hospital in Pune and very reputed for his wonderful talks. So I'm sure you will have a great time listening to this.
Good morning, friends. I'm going to talk on diagnosis of neck pain. In this talk, I will cover epidemiology of neck pain, what conditions can give rise to neck pain, how to assess the patient's pain, and to look for red flags and yellow flags in history. Neck pain is the fourth leading cause of disability with an annual prevalence of 37% and incidence of 18 to 23 per 1,000 per year. So it is a very common problem, more commonly seen in females, and the peak age is 50 to 59 years. It can be associated with several comorbidities like headache, back pain, arthralgia, and depression. For diagnosis of neck pain, you need to know what you're looking for. The first question you need to answer is whether the neck pain is of spinal origin. You don't want to miss conditions like acute coronary syndrome. Some of these patients may present with neck pain, interscapular pain, left shoulder pain with radiation. Patient who is looking not well with sweating, dyspnea, think of acute coronary syndrome. Patient with carotid or vertebral artery dissection, which are very rare, can present with stabbing pain in the neck. Similarly, herpes zoster, brachial neuritis, all this can present with neck and arm pain. There are few extraspinal musculoskeletal conditions like shoulder head syndrome, thoracic outlet syndrome, and shoulder rotator cuff pathologies, which can present as neck pain. So once you are sure that the pain is of spinal origin, there are various pathologies which can cause this pain, the most common being degenerative, but you don't want to miss all other pathologies like infection, neoplasm, etc. To reach a diagnosis, you need to keep your eyes open, your ears open, and take a proper history and do a good clinical examination, which will clinch the diagnosis. Investigations are just to confirm your diagnosis. To reach a diagnosis, I propose magic triage. The concept of triage is to make your life simple, to sort out your patients while taking the history into one of these three groups. One is the mechanical neck pain group, second is the nerve root pain group, and third is the serious spinal pathologies, which you will identify with red flags while taking the history. So I will go over each of these groups. The mechanical pain or the somatic neck pain is commonly due to cervical spondylosis. The pain is aggravated with activity and relieved with rest and immobilization. There's a whole lecture on cervical spondylosis after my talk, so I will not go into detail. The second common thing is C1, C2 arthritis. Patient complains of pain in the upper end of the neck with radiation to the occipital region. This is again commonly missed. And myofascial pain, which is very common in clinical practice. Patient gets pain at trigger points and also complains of nodules or bands. The risk factors for neck pain are genetic, smoking, obesity, sedentary lifestyle, trauma, sports injuries, and certain professions like healthcare workers, manual laborers, and IT professionals are more predisposed to neck pain. You must have all heard about texting neck, which is due to excessive use of mobile. So when you flex your neck to 60 degrees, the pressure on the disc is as high as 60 pounds and can result in neck pain. Similarly, one more controversial thing is helmet and neck pain. It has been shown that if you use helmet for more than 40 hours or a poor quality helmet, it can result in neck pain. Also, you need to do a psychosocial assessment while taking the history because a lot of these patients can present with neck pain. So poor job or home environment, poor sleep, multiple consultations, a distressed personality, widespread tenderness, normal neurology with major morbidity are all called yellow flags. The second group is the neurogenic pain. So unlike the first group, which was just neck pain and mechanical origin, in the second group, the pain is due to pressure on the nerves or the spinal cord. So if the nerve gets pinched, the commonest cause is cervical PID or prolapse intervertebral disc. So the patient complains of pain which radiates to the arm with tingling and numbness, commonly aggravated at night time. Patient usually will walk in the clinic with the arms supported above the head. There will be weakness in the hand. Spurling sign where you flex the neck laterally, patient can get radiating pain in the arm. The choice of investigation is MRI, as you can see here, a large cervical disc. The second cause of neurogenic pain is cervical myelopathy. Here the spinal cord gets pressed, unlike the cervical radiculopathy where the nerve root gets pinched. So the two common causes of myelopathy, one is cervical spondylotic myelopathy or what we call as CSM. So because of multi-level spondylosis, the space for the spinal cord decreases due to the pressure of the disc and the facets. Or the OPLL, which is ossification of posterior longitudinal ligament. So there's a ligament behind the vertebral bodies which gets ossified and decreases the space for spinal cord. So all these patients usually will present with neck pain and other problems related to neurology. So classically, they have loss of balance while walking, tingling numbness in the limbs, weakness in hands, difficulty in buttoning shirt, difficulty in grasping objects, and they may also develop bladder and bowel symptoms. So all these patients, you need to do an MRI and refer them to the specialist. You need to do a neurological examination. You should be aware about the various myotomes, dermatomes, the reflexes, and especially the abnormal reflexes. This is the Hoffman sign where you flick the DIP joint and there is flexion of the IP joint of the thumb, and the invited supinator reflex where you do a brachioradialis and there is flexion of the fingers. These abnormal reflexes indicate upper motor neuron lesion or pressure on the spinal cord. Finally, the third group, which is the sinister spinal pathologies, are the red flags on history. If you elicit, you should think about this. So if there's a history of trauma, then that would be an indication to get an X-ray. The X-ray should always show the C6, C7 disc. Otherwise, you can miss an injury. Here in the CT scan, you can see the C6, C7 dislocation, which was missed on the plain X-ray. History of systemic symptoms like fever, weight loss, anorexia, night pains suggest infection. Here on the MRI, you can see a C1, C2 infection. Usually, these patients will walk into the OPD supporting their head with their arms like this. History of rheumatoid arthritis patients, usually 20% will have cervical spine affection, and they can get the C1, C2 subluxation and dislocations. History of malignancy, this patient had history of CA lung, and on the MRI, you can see C3 metastasis. Spondyloarthropathy history. So this patient has got ankylosing spondylitis, and he has got something called as Anderson's lesion, which is seen at C7D1. Immunocompromised patient, severe neurological symptoms, altered bladder bowel habit should all raise suspicion of major pathologies. Severe restriction of movements or a deformity, as this child has got torticollis, he has got C1, C2 dislocation. So all these red flags should alert the clinician that there is some important pathology and you should do the appropriate investigation and refer them to the specialist. Finally, once you finish your history and clinical examination, you can do the appropriate investigation, most common being the X-ray of the cervical spine, AP and lateral views, MRI if you suspect any nerve root plane or if there are any red flags, CT scan for OPLL or if there is any contraindication to MRI, PET scan for suspected malignancy, and hematological investigations like hemogram ESR and CRP for suspected infections. So to summarize, history and clinical examination is key for diagnosis. Group the patients into the mechanical pain or the nerve root pain. Look for red flags so that you don't miss sinister pathologies. Assess the psychological profile by eliciting yellow flags. X-rays, MRI, and hematological parameters are the key investigations for diagnosis of neck pain. Thank you.
Dr. Lele, would you like to take over?
Yeah, see, I think first of all, let me thank the organizers that this is the entire program. What I have seen, it is really meant for the family physicians and the real grassroots level issues with the spines, various spines basically. And spine, which our friend just now colleague talked. I think, can we have all the questions together or there will be piecemeal?
No question. I just wanted you to invite the next speaker, sir.
Acha, who is the speaker?
Dr. Ashok Thomas is the next speaker, and he is going to talk about cervical spondylosis and its sequelae. So
yeah.
We will invite Dr. Thomas.
Sure. Thank you so much. Thank you. I will invite Dr. Ashok Thomas. He is going to talk on cervical spondylosis and its sequelae. Please, Ashok Thomas, over to you. Sir.
Yeah, good morning. Today my topic is cervical spondylosis and its sequelae. So spondylosis, spondylitis, spondylodiscitis, and spondylolisthesis are very common terms we hear in our day-to-day practice. And let's see what each of these words mean. Spondylosis means wear and tear or degeneration of the spine. Spondylitis means infection or inflammation of the vertebra. And spondylodiscitis means infection or inflammation of the vertebra and disc. And spondylolisthesis means a forward slipping of one vertebra over the other. So these are very commonly used, and today we'll be dealing only with the spondylosis, which is a blanket term for the wear and tear or degeneration of the spine, which includes both disc prolapse, disc osteophyte complex, ligamentum flavum hypertrophy. All of these together, they're called as spondylosis. So this is a picture of a spondylotic cervical spine. We can see that there is irregularity of the bony margins, and there is a narrowing of the disc space here. And there is also the foramen is getting narrowed due to the osteophyte. So depending on whether the osteophyte is narrowing, impinging on the nerve root or the spinal cord, patient may have different symptoms. If it is impinging on the nerve root, he may get what is called as a radiculopathic symptoms. And if it is impinging on the spinal cord here, then he will develop what is called as the cervical myelopathy, which is basically the compression of the spinal cord and its consequences. And this is a picture of a spondylotic spine. You can see that there is a lot of osteophytes here. Anteriorly flowing osteophytes are here. There is also narrowing of the disc space. And the MRI picture, if we look carefully, we can see that there is encroachment of the spinal canal with some black colored thing that is a posterior longitudinal ligament, and along with that there is also a disc protrusion at each of these levels. All of them contribute towards narrowing of the spinal canal, ultimately compressing the spinal cord and possibly leading on to dysfunction of the spinal cord, motor as well as sensory functions. And this is also a picture that is depicting the different pathologies that lead to cervical spondylotic myelopathy or radiculopathy. So we have the disc protrusion here, we have the osteophytes here. The nerve roots can get compressed, or the spinal cord can get compressed with these degenerative changes. The symptoms of cervical spondylosis basically can result from either a single disc herniation or a multiple disc herniation, or single segmental ligamentum flavum hypertrophy or multiple segmental ligamentum flavum hypertrophy. They all result in three symptom complexes, that is axial neck pain or radiculopathy or myelopathy. Axial neck pain basically refers to pain along the midline, along the spine, or just along the paraspinal area. And the picture here actually refers to shows the referral pattern, referred pain resulting from the cervical spondylosis at each of these segments. That is, you can see that C2-3 segment degeneration will cause pain in the suboccipital region. C4-5 will cause along the superior aspect of the scapula, as well as in the lateral aspect of neck. And the scapular area and the inferior angle of the scapula, C6-7, and slightly higher will be C5. So this, depending on where the patient is pointing towards describing his pain, we can come to a conclusion where approximately what is the level we are looking at, the level of pathology we are looking at. So the pain may radiate from the occiput to the shoulder or to the scapula or to the arms, and characteristically the pain varies with position. It's not a constant pain. The pain may get relieved in some position and it's aggravated in some other positions. And patients may also have some chronic suboccipital headache. And some patients may also complain of giddiness or vertigo, which is supposedly due to a narrowing of the blood supply due to the compression of the vertebral artery in the foramen and consequently decreasing the basilar artery supply. So that was about the axial neck pain and the referred pain. So the cervical radicular pain basically is a pain or paresthesia along a particular nerve root, and this pain may get affected, may get relieved with abduction of the shoulder and placing the arm over the head in this position. And in this picture, we can see where each of these nerve roots supply, and subsequently we can know where exactly the pain is coming from, which root is getting affected for the patient. So in addition to the pain and the paresthesia, patient may also have motor weakness, and each of the roots have their own myotomal supply. And this chart is showing that deltoid, wrist extension, wrist flexion, finger flexion, and interossei, depending on C5, 6, 7, or T1 root is getting affected. So cervical myelopathy is a compression of the spinal cord, and it's compression of the spinal cord and its neurological consequences. So severe or long-standing compression can lead to permanent damage of the spinal cord. So the cervical, it is quite different from cervical radiculopathy, where the main symptom is pain. But cervical myelopathy, the pain is not a major symptom. The symptoms arise from basically dysfunction of spinal cord. There is a weakness, there can be a gait imbalance, there can be loss of manual dexterity. And this usually results from both static as well as dynamic factors. That is, static factors are the compressing elements like ligamentum flavum and the disc osteophyte complex, while the dynamic elements are basically the instability resulting from movement, abnormal movement at each particular segment. So it is a cervical spondylotic myelopathy is the most serious consequence of cervical intervertebral disc degeneration, especially when it is associated with a narrow cervical canal, and it has an insidious onset and typically becomes apparent in persons more than 50 years of age. So this is the flexion and extension picture showing that during extension, the ligamentum flavum buckles out and the spinal cord also slightly thickens due to the decrease in stretching. And this ultimately results in decrease in space for the cord and resulting in the damage for the spinal cord. So cervical myelopathy, the symptoms, if we look at the symptoms there, it is characterized by minimal pain. And the main symptoms would be gait imbalance and paresthesia in hands or trunk. And there will be loss of manual dexterity, that is loss of fine movements with the hand, in which the patient may say that he is not able to button his shirts properly without taking help from others, or his handwriting is changing. And maybe his signature is changing in recent times. And also the radicular symptoms may also be present. Radicular symptoms like we described just now, pain, paresthesia, and weakness of particular nerve root. And patient may also have bowel or bladder symptom, which is quite late in presentation and which is not a very good sign. So other clinical signs are Lermit signs, in which there is an electric sensation along the neck radiating down to the thoracic spine when there is a when we forcibly flex the neck or forcibly extend the neck. Characteristically, the deep tendon jerks are brisk, and this is one of the signs which should point towards a possible cervical myelopathy in these patients with cervical spondylosis. Plantar reflexes are usually extensor in these patients when there is established myelopathy. Hoffman's sign is flicking up, is the flexion of the distal phalangeal joints when you flick the distal interphalangeal joint of the middle finger. Inverted reflexes in the upper limb and finger escape sign, fist sign, all these are clinical signs that can point towards cervical myelopathy. So the grading for the cervical myelopathy, we can see that the numeric grading, it goes from grade 0 to grade 5. Progressive, it depicts the progressive disability of the patient. Grade 0 is only a root involvement. Grade 1 Patient doesn't know that he has myelopathy, but when the clinician looks at him and elicits the clinical signs, there is a lot of signs that is visible. So that is grade 1. And grade 5, and progressively it progresses to grade 5, in which the patient becomes wheelchair bound or bedridden. So myelopathy can progress. This can happen insidiously. Patient may present late, and surgery may not be able to reverse all the symptoms or the gait abnormality. So it is very important to diagnose this condition early, so that you can arrest the progression of this disease and help to save a lot of disability to the patient. So many of these symptoms in this age group may be passed off as age-related, like loss of balance and loss of manual dexterity. But it's very important that we pick up these signs, and especially because the complete reversal is rare once myelopathy gets established. So complete reversal of the symptoms may not be possible. So we can only arrest the progression. Treatment of the acute neck pain of radiculopathy without myelopathy. When there is no myelopathy, most patients respond to conservative treatment with analgesics and anti-inflammatory medications and a short course of physiotherapy with ultrasonic massage and diathermy. And ROM exercise, a range of movement exercises after reasonable pain relief, can also be advised. Cervical collar is not a long-term solution. It can be used for short-term for acute pain relief, but long-term use may lead to muscle atrophy. So hence it is not recommended to be used for a long term. Surgical treatment is needed only in a minority of patients when there is a radiculopathy. So when there is a radicular pain which is severe, persistent, and not responding to conservative treatment, then we would suggest a surgical treatment. And when there is a gross neurologic deficit or a progressive neurologic deficit, again, surgical treatment is the choice. When there is myelopathy and there are signs of cord compression, then again, surgery should be advised as early as possible to prevent the further progression of the disease. So once again, just emphasizing on the red flags that we should look for to detect early myelopathy, that is gait instability, bladder symptoms, loss of manual dexterity, and Lermit sign. It must be looked for in each and every case of cervical spondylosis at least once during the follow-up, whenever the patient comes to us. To summarize, cervical spondylosis is a very common problem, and most patients get good relief with the course of analgesics and physio. Cervical radiculopathy, not responding to conservative treatment, may need surgical intervention. Subtle symptoms and signs of cervical myelopathy must be looked for in all cases. Early surgery in cervical myelopathy can prevent patient from becoming debilitated. Thank you.
So after a nice elucidation of cervical problems, including the rational approach to neck pain and cervical spondylosis, we move on to a very common problem these days. As our population is aging, the incidence of osteoporosis is increasing. I think most spine surgeons on this panel must be seeing at least 2 to 3 patients with osteoporotic vertebral fractures at least once a week. So it has become that common. And to tell us how to deal with this problem and the solutions, I invite Dr. ML Bansal, who is a consultant spine surgeon at the Indian Spinal Injury Center in New Delhi.
Good morning, everyone. Myself, ML Bansal, and I will be speaking on osteoporotic vertebral compression fracture, a pandemic that is out of control. Indeed, it is a pandemic, but it has not been given its due importance, not talked or discussed as it should have been. Osteoporosis is a global burden. Why I am saying so? There are 200 million women worldwide are affected by this problem. Osteoporotic fractures outnumbered heart attacks by margin. Every 3 seconds, there is one fracture somewhere in the world. 80% of these fractures went unnoticed, undiagnosed, and untreated. Number of people on high risk of getting these fractures will be doubled by 2040. Indian perspective, India is called world capital for osteoporosis, and rightly so, because prevalence of osteoporosis in India is much higher than any other country in the world. 1 out of 8 male and 1 out of 3 female suffering with this disease. 65% of people over age of 50 are affected, and 80% out of them are women. Why this prevalence is so high in Indian population? Because of aging population, and increasing life expectancy. One more peculiar thing, peak incidence in Indian population is much less. 10-20 years younger population are getting affected. And this is only tip of iceberg. Problem is much deeper and bigger. Let's understand bone composition. Bone is composed of 5% cells and 95% of extracellular matrix. Out of that, 2/3 is inorganic material and 1/3 is organic component. Bone remodel itself regularly, repair micro damages, and maintain skeletal health. Osteoblastic and osteoclastic activity are in good equilibrium. Osteoblastic activity promotes bone formation. Osteoblastic activity causes bone resorption. When this equilibrium disturbs, it leads to osteoporosis. Peak bone mass is important to understand this concept. Peak bone mass is a maximum mass of bone gained by an individual from childhood to skeletal maturity, which is around 25 to 35 years. After gaining this peak bone mass, everyone starts losing it at various speeds. In different individuals, this speed will be different. Women loses faster than men, and this speed of losing bone mass in women even much faster after menopause. This peak bone mass determined by a few factors, but physical activity and nutrition is the two factors which can be managed, controlled, by which one can improve their peak bone mass. So osteoporosis can be defined as a condition, disease where old bone is removed faster than bone formation, which lead to microarchitectural changes, which enhance its susceptibility and increases the risk of fracture. Osteoporosis can be classified into primary and secondary. Primary is physiological, postmenopausal type 1 and senile type 2. Secondary depend on external factors like drugs, disease, and conditions. These are the few risk factors which lead to osteoporosis. They can be divided into modifiable and non-modifiable. Modifiable are sedentary lifestyle, alcohol, chronic smoking, nutrition deficiency. Non-modifiable are age, female sex, family history, race, and history of prior fracture. How patient will present? Most of the cases are asymptomatic. They're diagnosed incidentally. But some may present with history of loss of height over time, may complain neck or low back pain, may present with fracture with little or no history of trauma. You can check for wall occiput distance and rib pelvic distance to diagnose any occult fracture. How to diagnose? X-ray is the first line of investigation. One must look for increased radiolucency, wasing of vertebra, or reduced vertebral height in a plain X-ray. But before these radiological changes appear, there are almost 30% bone loss already happen. DEXA, dual energy X-ray absorptiometry, is the gold standard in diagnosing osteoporosis. What it does, it measures bone density in a mineral density in an individual and compared it against 30-year-old person of same race and sex and denotes as a T-score. So if T-score is less than -2.5 standard deviation, then it diagnosed as a osteoporosis. MRI and CT have limited value in diagnosing osteoporosis. Let's discuss some thing about vertebral compression fracture. Mostly they happen between T8 and L2. They may present acute back pain or some girdle pain. They will be tender to palpate, but rarely they present with neurological deficit. Only 30% of these fractures are clinically evident. One fracture lead to increase the risk of another fracture by 23-24%. These fractures causes spinal deformity. They increase thoracic kyphosis or decrease lumbar lordosis. Once vertebral compression fracture happen, it severely impact quality of life of a person. It's a vicious cycle. It starts with pain, decreases mobility, causes dependency on other people, diminished social roles, and causes low self-esteem of a person. So what about management? Management has two parts. management of vertebral compression fracture per se, and management of osteoporosis. Management of osteoporosis has two aspects, non-pharmacological and pharmacological. We can understand this by this pyramid. Base of the pyramid consists of lifestyle changes like nutrition, good nutrition, physical activity, and fall prevention. Center of the pyramid consists of addressing the factors responsible for osteoporosis, secondary factors, and top tip of the pyramid consists of pharmacotherapy. So lifestyle modification include good exercises, avoiding the risk factors, adequate sun exposure, good nutrition supplementation, prevention of fall. It includes modification at home and workplace to prevent fall. Pharmacotherapy include calcium vitamin D supplementation and bisphosphonates. Bisphosphonates are the most common drug prescribed for the treatment of osteoporosis. It effectively reduces fracture risk by 30 to 50%. Most commonly prescribed bisphosphonates are alendronate, ivandronate, and zoledronate. Denosumab is a relatively new drug used for the treatment of postmenopausal osteoporosis. It improves bone density and decreases fracture risk. Teriparatide is the most important drug. It is the only anabolic agent which leads to bone formation and thus increases bone formation, increases bone strength, decreases vertebral fracture risk by 65% and non-vertebral fracture risk by 45%. Calcitonin used in combination with other drugs, mainly for its analgesic effect on vertebral fracture pain. Treatment of vertebral compression fracture conservatively as a treatment mainly consists of analgesics, bed rest, and immobilization, but they have their own side effects. Indication for surgical management includes failure of conservative treatment, persistent pain, any deformity, progressive deformity, and neurological deficit. And options are vertebroplasty, kyphoplasty, pedicular fixation with or without cement augmentations. Vertebroplasty, where we inject cement by transpedicular route in the affected vertebra. Kyphoplasty, where before injecting cement, we insert a balloon, inflate it, try to reduce the fracture, and then inject cement. This is an example of kyphoplasty in a case of vertebral compression fracture. Pedicular screw fixation, where fixation is required to reduce deformity, or where we need do decompression, we need some fixation, and because bone quality is poor, so we have to augment the cement to increase the bone screw hold in the bone. But most important aspect of osteoporosis to prevent, how to prevent osteoporosis. Number one, improving peak bone mass by considering or focusing on the two factors, nutrition and physical activity. Decreasing risk factors responsible for losing bone mass. Early detection of osteoporosis is the key. Proper treatment and regular follow-up. These are the 5 steps by which we can prevent osteoporosis. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bansal. I think you have clearly outlined what Dr. Jayalal told us earlier in the day, that prevention is worth a pound of cure. And here is osteoporosis is an entirely or to a large extent a preventable disease. With regular exercise, proper nutrition, and anti-osteoporotic medication as indicated, it could be really, the risk could be reduced. And with that, Dr. Lele, would you like to invite the next speaker, please?
Thank you, Dr. Bansal. And regarding once we go for the further cervical spines, we have Dr. Gautam Prasad, who is going to talk about the issues, the spinal tuberculosis and the need for awareness. I think request Dr. Gautam Prasad to start the presentation.
Good morning. Greetings of the day. Spinal tuberculosis. So this is a topic, and we are going to see why an awareness program is necessary for spinal tuberculosis. Now, why TB spine is actually relevant in India? Because per year, around 10 millions of cases are reported worldwide, of which India contributes around 23%. And of these TB cases, there are 3 to 4% which are extrapulmonary, and of these, 10 are skeletal tuberculosis. Point to be noted is 50% of these TB cases are in spine. And the usual presentation are in the form of pain, weakness, deformity, swelling. So the pain is usually dull in character to begin with, and then it becomes very intense, which is more at night. This can be accompanied with weakness in the upper limbs, lower limbs, or both, and there might be bowel bladder involvement. Delayed presentation can be in the form of gibbous, deformity of the back. At times, the abscess presents in the form of swelling, and constitutional symptoms like fever, loss of appetite can be present. So, which are the red flags which should alert anybody? Severe pain, pain in the thoracic spine, neurological weakness, and deformity of the back. And the way to diagnose is, first comes the imaging, the X-rays, MRI, and scans. In X-rays, as in pointed out, one can see there is decrease in disc space or destruction of the pedicles, which can be appreciated on AP as well as lateral view, or the patient can present with a deformity of the back. On MRI, we can appreciate the same with changes on the T1 and T2 images seen on the bony destruction and abscess formation. This also gives an idea of the compression of the neural elements, the spinal cord. And in CT, better delineation of the bony destruction is seen. MR contrast helps in diagnosing the compression and to rule out many other problems. But these are just pointing towards the diagnosis. The real confirmation comes with histopathological diagnosis and culture and gene expert. For this, we need either a USG guided or CT guided biopsy. Now, why biopsy is a must? Because it helps to differentiate from other pathologies, like TB might mimic other pathologies like myeloma, metastasis, eosinophilic granuloma, or ABC, that is aneurysmal bone cyst, or giant cell tumor. So to differentiate and confirm our diagnosis, we need to do a biopsy before we start the treatment. Also, this helps us to grow the bug, and once we know we can grow the bug in lab, we can do testing and check out if they are resistant to rifampicin, isoniazid, or any other drugs. So that also helps to know whether we are dealing with multi-drug regimen, multi-drug resistant tuberculosis. Once we are sure of the diagnosis, then comes the management part. As is true with everything, there can be conservative, that is non-surgical management, as well as surgical management. The key is to first rule out whether the patient needs any surgical intervention. Other than those, everybody can be patiently conserved. So management in patients who don't need surgery are rest, in the form of rest for 3 to 4 weeks, depending on how bad the pain is and how badly the patient is disabled, and anti-tubercular medications. The usual way to monitor is to have a regular follow in the form of clinical examination, in which one has to check out pain, check out if there is deformity developing, any weakness which is progressing or weakness is getting better, and how is the patient's activity of daily living. What is the pain medication requirement? On radiological basis, we can check with an X-ray and MR whether there is resolving edema, there is resolving soft tissue shadow, that is the abscess, and this can be repeated every 3 months. The MRI can be done every 3 months. Blood parameters like ESR are helpful to prognosticate the disease. Liver function tests are done to rule out that there is no liver injury caused because of ATT. KFT is to be done, especially if we are doing second line of therapy is being given. Now, basically the drugs are divided into first line ATT, that is isoniazid, rifampicin, pyrazinamide, and ethambutol, which are given in the form of 5 mg, 10 mg, 25 and 15 mg per kg body weight. And there are second line of TB medications, in which it is divided into 3 groups. And as per the recent guidelines, 3 agents of group A, which is leoflox, bedaquiline, linezolid, they are to be added. Along with that, one has to add 1 or 2 drugs of group B, and group C is there to just complement if we are not able to add many drugs of group A and B. Now, the other major decision making is surgery. Surgery is done if the patient presents with severe deficit, or if the patient is on treatment and on treatment develops neurological weakness. There are other cases in which there is deformity which is persisting or worsening, or there are healed cases which present with deformity leading to cord compression, leading to paraparesis or quadriparesis. So these are the cases in which deformity correction surgery is warranted. Also, another reason is instability. So if the patient continues to heal but the pain persists, then we call as an unstable spine. So these are the cases who will need surgical intervention as well. Some myths and facts I would like to enumerate. Does surgery increases the spread of disease? Definitely no. Implants, are they safe in infection? Definitely yes. Whether it is titanium or steel, the biological films of tuberculosis, they don't form on this. Spine surgery causes paralysis. Is it? No. In fact, spine surgery helps in patients who are developing paralysis and also in reversal of this paralysis by causing decompression during surgery. Is spine surgery alternative to medicine? Definitely no. 90% of the patients will improve with medicines. Only 10% will need surgical intervention, and surgery is a part of the treatment, not the entire treatment. Some examples of surgical results, and we had excellent results in even deformity corrections, whether it is cervical spine, lumbar spine, all these things. So surgery is actually beneficial, and one has to have a tailor-made treatment for all the patients. Have a watchful or superficial neglect, that is the key for conservative management, that is a non-surgical management. And surgery, whenever one needs to do, it has to be a tailor-made thing, and surgery has a very definite and very specific role in specific conditions only. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Prasad. And this brings us to the last talk of the session, which is probably the culmination of a spine surgeon's training, and that is spinal deformity. So we will invite Dr. Dheeraj Sonawane, who is an associate professor of spine orthopedics and a consultant spine surgeon working at the JJ Hospital group of hospitals in Bombay. Dr. Sonawane, please.
Hello friends, I am Dr. Dheeraj Sonawane. I work as an associate professor and heading a unit at Gokuldas Deshpal Hospital and Grand Medical College. I thank ASSI for this wonderful opportunity. So today I will be discussing on scoliosis and spine deformity. And for my IIMA colleagues, I have made it very simple for them. So you can see this is a normal alignment of spine. If we see a person from front or from behind, a line drawing from the center of the skull or the occiput just transects vertically towards the ground. It passes through the center of the sacrum. Even if it's within 2 centimeters, it is considered to be normal. Similarly, a line passed from the auditory external auditory meatus drop down. Okay, it passes through the hip. Okay, and laterally up to the greater tuberosity. Okay, and you can see in coronally the spine is relatively straight, while if you see the person from side, which is a sagittal alignment, you can see there is a cervical lordosis, there is a thoracic kyphosis, and lumbar lordosis. So what is scoliosis? So if we see the person from behind and there is a lateral deviation of the spine, on measurement, if it's more than 10 degrees, then it is called as scoliosis. We measure with the help of Cobb's. Okay, there's a particular method of measurement, and in the Cobb's measurement of this major curve is 126 degrees. So this is very severe form of scoliosis. You can see the typical appearance of scoliosis. There is a hip prominence on the left side. The shoulder is slightly imbalanced. Okay, there is a right-sided rib hump, and left-sided you can see the thorax has gone deep. You can also see there is a iliocostal impingement of the left side. Okay, and this is a kyphosis. If we see a patient from behind, you can see there is a significant humping of the spine. Okay, and in the X-ray, you can see the significant angulation from the lateral X-ray. So this is a kyphosis. Apart from this three plane, now there is a third plane deformity, which is a rotational deformity. So for every deformity, we should consider a rotation element. There is also always some form of rotation element. So all these deformity, you always should be assessed in three planes. So this is how we measure COBS. So COBS, what we see, whether the deformity is 10 degree, 50 degree, 100 degree, or more than that, how we say that? So we say according to the COBS angle. So in a simple word, how we measure COBS is from the from the ends of the curve. Okay, the most tilted vertebra at the end of the curve, we draw a line parallel to the upper end plate. Okay, and for sake of easy measurement, we draw another perpendicular line to that. Okay, in this case, it is measured to be 90 degree. So how does this patient presents? This usually presents with pain, rib hump. You can see there is a shoulder imbalance. Okay, there is an increased flanks on the concave side, and also there is a hip prominence on one side. Okay, patient may present with difficulty in wearing clothes, or sometimes neurological presentation with loss of balance. Okay, some weakness, sphincter involvement might be there. The physiological effect of scoliosis, many patient complaints of pain over neck, back, or lower back region. Okay. Apart from that, there is an increased risk of neurological complication, even if it's not right now, it is later on. Okay. There is a risk of pulmonary dysfunction, especially in early onset scoliosis when the pulmonary function has to be developed in early childhood. These patients are at risk of early disc degeneration, okay, and joint degeneration. So how we assess that? So for assessing that, you can see a normal spine on the left side. If we, this is an Adams forward bending test. We ask we ask the patient to stand with the and bend forward. Okay, we go from behind. Okay, and with eyes parallel to the back after bending. Okay, we try to compare both the sides of the paraspinal region. Okay, on left side you can see it is at the same level. Okay, when there is a deformity on the convex side, there is a the aggravation of the deformity is will be seen. Okay, in scoliosis. Okay, we can measure this with a scoliometer. Also, there is some easily available apps where we can utilize it for measurement. Sometimes, if we draw a line from cervical vertebra down, there will be significant shifting of the trunk, which is we call as C7 plump line. In normal patient, it should be passing straight down in the gluteal cleft. So in brief, what are the type of scoliosis? So starting from the right side, so after trauma or wedging of the or collapse of the vertebra, there can, or after a surgery, there can be a deformity. It can be after wear and tear, aging, which is called a degenerative scoliosis, which is also very common. Okay. Congenital scoliosis, which can be due to failure of formation or segmentation. I have explained briefly what is that in later slide. Neuromuscular, the name suggests it can be due to neurological or a muscular component. Okay. If none of this cause has been found, then it is considered to be idiopathic, which is the commonest type of scoliosis. Okay. And we further divide idiopathic as per the age. If it's 0 to 3 years, then it is infantile. If it's 3 to 10 years, then it is juvenile, and more than 10 is adolescent, which is the commonest kind. So this is congenital scoliosis. So it might be failure of formation, segmentation, or mixed type. Failure formation means you can see the small vertebra on the left in the diagram in the figure. It is formed. It is not formed properly. It is failure of formation, and you can see in middle there is a failure of segmentation. That means the vertebra is formed, but it is not able to separate from each other. That is failure of segmentation, or it might be mixed of that. Okay, and these all X-rays we get it done for all the deformity patients. We try to assess this patient with a skeletal maturity, which is very important for assessment of the and deciding the management. Okay, CT has been done for detailed analysis. We do 3D CT as well, MRI to rule out intraspinal anomaly. In treatment, we do casting. There is a growth rod, so we can for early onset or scoliosis in children, we to maintain the growth of the spine and to prevent further progression of the curve, we do going rod technique. Okay, other techniques like bracing has been used very widely, especially in scoliosis between 20 to 40 degree, which doesn't usually require surgery. Halo traction is very useful, especially in severe deformity before surgery, to make it more lax and stretch the spine. So the surgery part will be much easier. Okay, with the help of the present instrumentation, especially pedicle screws, it passes from posteriorly into the pedicle into the body. Okay, this is the strongest form of instrumentation of the spine. This is the case of posterior instrumentation. You can see how the significant correction after the surgery. Okay. Sometimes anterior surgery might be done, and the present day thoracoscopic, with the help of two small incisions, we can, with the help of scope, we can insert the screws and correct the deformity. This is just like a sutureless surgery. In recent times, there has been significant advances in last decades in spine surgery, and this has been widely applied in deformity. Intraoperative neuromonitoring is one of the stuff we use. It tells us here during the surgery where the screws and the cord is functioning well or not. 3D C-arm, which will help us to confirm the position of screws. Navigation, especially in difficult pedicles. Bone scalpel is another advances, which this bone scalpel doesn't cut the neurous tissue, any soft tissue. It only cuts the bone. Okay. So these are the cases. You can see there is a significant correction after posterior surgery. You can see almost normally looking spine for a more than 100-degree scoliosis curve. So these are the this is a kyphosis of almost more than 90 degree. You can see it is corrected to near normal angulation. Thank you.
Hello. Yeah, thank you very much, Dheeraj. That was a very nice talk, enlightening the entire spectrum of problems that are associated with the tuberculosis, with spinal deformity. And as we come to the end of this session, I'm sure there must be a lot of questions. Dr. Lele, would you like to start the ball rolling by asking any questions to the panel?
Sure. Thank you, sir. Thank you, Dr. Gautam. I have one little question for Dr. Ashok Thomas, because he explained that the terms of the cervical lithiasis, spondylitis, and various terms. But when in general practice, when we sit there, when we see the patient on the very first day, or sometimes after 2 days before diagnosis also, their complaints are very common. Sometimes there will be tingling numbness, sometimes there will be difficult to hold a hand, and sometimes there will be just pain, cervical spondylosis. And ultimately, the treatment line, how much will differ at the end of the, all these things, and whether there is an operative indications will be there, or it can be tackled at a GP level, or just a physiotherapy or something like that. I think little more, if you can give for the family physician who sees the patient in the beginning, when the complaint is just tingling numbness, and all the three may be having origin tingling numbness, neuritis or something like that, but then ultimately in the cervical there's a difference. So I think how at the GP will be able to differentiate and do detailed investigation.
Yeah,
I think
so,
if you can tell us
the
better.
question primarily lies in the fact that there are a number of other differentials for tingling numbness. You could have carpal tunnel syndrome, ulnar nerve neuritis. These can also cause tingling numbness. So how do you go about, if a patient comes to you with tingling numbness in the hand, how do you go about differentiating and saying this pathology is the cervical spine and this pathology is something different? Ashok?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, tingling and numbness that is basically confined to the palm is usually we can attribute it to the carpal tunnel syndrome. The cervical spine pathology leading on to tingling and numbness usually radiates from the neck onwards and down to the hand. And it usually will be localized to one of the dermatomes, which I showed in a diagram, in which C6, C5, or C7, whichever route we can localize. So always it is going to be a clinico-radiological correlation also. We also have to ask the patient regarding the investigations done, or whether he has pain on the other side, whether there are lower limb symptoms. If there are symptoms in all four limbs, then a problem of neuropathy should also be considered, and also cervical spine pathology like cervical myelopathy should be kept in mind. So clinical examination with all the clinical signs which we said, including deep tendon reflexes and plantar reflexes, gait of the patient should be taken into account, and also the motor power of the patient of each myotome should be taken into account. And this should be correlated along with the MRI or the X-ray and the MRI, which I mean, if the findings are correlating with the MRI findings showing some spinal cord compression is correlating with the symptoms, then we can say that it's probably coming from the cervical spine. Also, we can also use nerve conduction studies to augment our diagnosis. That is to rule out any peripheral neuropathy as a cause, or a carpal tunnel syndrome. All this can be conclusively delineated by tests like nerve conduction study.
Thank you. Amol, the question to you is, now, as Dr. Lele pointed out, he's sitting in his clinic. What are the 3 or 4 clinical scenarios he will see in his clinic, and how should he triage them?
I think, as I said in my talk before, the most important thing is a good history. The whole thing should be emphasis on diagnosis rather than treatment. You need to reach a proper diagnosis before. And on a good history, you can classify the patients into 3 groups. If they have only neck pain, then it's usually mechanical neck pain due to spondylosis. If they have arm pain, arm tingling, numbness, then it goes to suggest that there is some pressure on the nerve root. Now, this nerve root pressure can be because of cervical spine etiology, or can be due to other conditions, as Gautam said, carpal tunnel syndrome, ulnar neuritis, etc. And then finally, you don't want to miss those red flags. I would like to re-emphasize that somebody comes with neck pain with 2 days history of fever is a completely different patient than just having neck pain for 3 months. So those patients, you need to investigate them immediately. So on history, if you can group them into one of these 3 in your private practice, then I think you have won the battle there halfway. And then you can do appropriate investigations. Those who are having red flags, you investigate them immediately. Those who are having neck pain, you can give them analgesics, physiotherapy, get a baseline X-ray. And those who are having nerve root pain, which is not settling down, or having nerve root deficit, you can ask for an MRI. And if the MRI shows important findings, you can refer them to specialists. So this is what I would advise the general practitioners to go about managing neck pain in their clinics.
Dr. Bansore, any questions for any of the panelists in this session?
No, sir.
All right. So we go on to Dr. Dheeraj Sonawade. Dr. Sonawade, you showed horrendous images of scoliosis where the child was completely deformed. Is scoliosis purely a cosmetic deformity, or can it lead to other problems because of which we should be aware of and they should be treated?
Thank you, sir, for the question. So early onset scoliosis, as I've already mentioned, it leads to cardiopulmonary dysfunction, and if they are not treated properly, these patients won't have a normal life in future. For late scoliosis, suppose the congenital acute deformities, hemivertebras, these patients are at risk of neurodeficit, even of a tribal trauma or after a complete skeletal maturity. For adolescent scoliosis more than 40 degree, if we don't treat this patient with surgery, this patient progress slowly even beyond the skeletal maturity. Most of these patients present with back pain some neurology, and also these patients have a apart from cosmetic, these patients have a risk of developing early disc degenerations.
Right. So as you understood from Dr. Sonawne's description, that scoliosis is not purely a cosmetic deformity. Severe scoliosis can be psychologically disturbing to children, and they can also result in restrictive respiratory disease, so that patient can land up, as he mentioned, cardiopulmonary arrest. They can also have crouching of the abdomen, which can cause pain because of the impingement of the rib and the iliac crest. Some of the scoliosis are associated with tumors, tethering of cord, which can also cause pain. Some scoliosis may result in crouching of the stomach, and therefore they do not eat properly, or some deformities. I would not necessarily mention scoliosis can cause this. And finally, if a severe scoliosis is there, there is accelerated degeneration of the disc and the joints because of the abnormal loading of the scoliotic segment. It is vital that patients with scoliosis be recognized early in the disease process. Dr. Sonawne, is there a test which Dr. Lele or Dr. Bansode can do in their clinic to identify early scoliosis?
Yes, sir, that's the most. If you don't understand my talk, that is fine. But just try understanding how to detect the scoliosis in a clinic is the most important thing. So what I will request everyone to follow the Adams test with the patient undressed up to the gluteal cleft. You have
Can
to
you
see the
stand up
patient
and
from.
show, Dheeraj? Can you stand up and show it?
Okay. So it might be okay. So we have to see the patient from behind, and the shoulder balance has to be checked. The hip prominence has to be checked. Whether there is a prominence of one hip has to be checked. Whether the rib hump has is there on one side, that has to be checked. This is just a basic assessment on inspection. But the most important test is whenever we have a doubt, ask the patient to bend. So ask the patient to bend forward, and your eyes level has to be parallel to this back of the spine. There shouldn't be no prominence. Both the sides should be symmetrical in my case. But if there is some prominence on one side, one should suspect a scoliosis or a spine deformity.
What Dr. Sonawne described is called as the Adams forward bending test. It is a test
Yes,
which will help you to diagnose even very early scoliosis in children. You make the child bend forward, stand behind the child, and look for any asymmetry of the back. Or if one side is more prominent than the other, that is a scoliotic child whose X-ray must be done, and in which case you must do a standing epilateral X-ray of the spine. We now move on to Dr. Gautam Prasad. Dr. Prasad, you emphasize the importance of monitoring of patients with antituberculous treatment. But Dr. Kade, again from Delhi, asks you, sir, what is the duration of antituberculous treatment for spinal tuberculosis? Because for our patients with chest tuberculosis, they are giving only 6 months of tubercular medicine. Well, y'all are giving for 24 months.
Sir, as there is too much controversy about the duration of anti-tubercular drugs. The usual thing of 6 months, that is true for pulmonary TB, but for a skeletal TB, it has to be minimum 9 months. Having said that, we have got some patients who have healed well at 6 months and we have stopped that ATT. So how do I do that? Or most of us do that. So every 3 months, if possible, repeat an MRI. Minimum for 6 months, ATT has to be given. If at the end of 6 months or 9 months, whenever we see on MRI, there is good bony resolution in the form of no marrow abnormalities seen, there is fatty replacement, there is no abscess, and there is no epidural compression, then these are the signs that the disease has healed. So once we see that the disease has healed, we stop the medication. It might be at 9 months, it might be at 12 months or 15 months. This is for those patients in which we are giving the primary first line ATT.
Right.
Now, for secondary ATT, second line of ATT, whenever we are giving, there are two regimes. One is the short-term regime and one is the long-term regime. The long-term regime has to be continued for minimum 2 years, and one has to, at the end of 2 years, again repeat the MRI, confirm that there is a healed lesion, and stop it. Now, there
Right.
are short-term regime in which we have to give for only 9 months, but there are very specific conditions and specific medication is to be given, and that is for 9 months. And at the end of 9 months, you have to again repeat the MRI and confirm that the lesion has healed.
So
Did I
thank you
answer
very
that?
much, Gautam. I think that's beautifully answered question. I think also it is important for the family practitioners to remember what Dr. Gautam Prasad said. That how do you, the key in your clinic is to diagnose the patient. And how do you do it? If the patient comes with back pain, which is in the upper part of the back, that is in the thoracic region, if the patient has night pain when he's lying down, rest pain, or pain which is continuous, or pain which is not settling down but keeping on going on increasing over 3 to 4 weeks, if the pain is associated with fever, weight loss, anorexia, then do not ignore this condition, investigate the patient, and in order to try and diagnose this patient further. The first complaint is that of pain in most patients. Some patients will come with neurologic deficit, some patient may come with a deformity of the back, some people will come with swellings or discharging sinus. But this is the main thing. The final question is for Dr. Bansal. Dr. Bansal, the question is, what anti-osteoporotic treatment patient, all the patients who come are nowadays on chronic renal failure, liver functional abnormalities, patients are coming with pulmonary problems, they are all on steroids, etc. How do we prevent osteoporosis in these patients? What is the best method?
Thank you, sir. Best method is first is if the patient is on chronic medications, they have to be supplemented with calcium supplementation and good nutrition, along with physical activity as much as they can do. And if there is established osteoporosis, they should be started on anti-resorptive. And if investigations like parathyroid hormone is within normal limit, you can start with teriparatide if it is severe osteoporosis.
Right.
So mainstay is detection, diagnosis of osteoporosis, and first is nutritional supplementation. Second is physical activity as much they can be allowed and can do, and simultaneously they should be start if this is established osteoporosis with an anti-resorptive or other medication for osteoporosis.
Dr. Lele, are you still here? I don't see.
Yeah, I am
Dr.
there.
Lele. Yes,
I
sir,
have
you
one
had a
very-
question. Please ask.
I have a small question. I'm audible.
Yes,
Yes,
yes.
sir. Yes, sir.
Yeah. See, what is occurring is that during the corona issue, now the fashion is that is work from home. And work from home. These IT people at home, they may not have that particular good chairs, good support, or all positions they are working. And last 3-4 months, I am seeing a lot of these problems of the spines, especially the upper half of the spine and the cervical, because they are just bending and working 12 hours. So I think this is right now, this is not a major issue, but in the years to come. So how would you advise these people to go about it? Because this is every day in and out, they tell this is the pain, I have taken this tablet, that tablet. Major, there is no issue, but this is going to be the, the coming issues after some time.
Right, sir. Sir, the first advice is to you, not to your patients. And that is, sir, please relocate to Ghatkopar where I practice so that you can refer them to me. But but in the meanwhile, I'll get Dr. Amol Rege to answer this question.
Yeah, as Dr. Lele said, this is going to be a very common problem in future. And the most important thing really is what is called as work ergonomics. So that involves a lot of advice to the patient, a lot of counseling to the patient. And actually, we in our practice don't find much time. It is better to refer to a physiotherapist who can sit with them, talk to them about posture, at what eye level your computer should be, how you can adjust your laptop, and they can spend time with them, teach them exactly about posture, how important it is for your day-to-day work. Also, the mobile, excessive use of mobile causes a lot of problems. A lot of patients will use their mobile that way. So all this needs to be explained and taught to them in work ergonomics and strengthening of the muscles. These are the two things which will prevent these long-term problems.
Thank you very much,
Thank you, sir.
Amol.
Thank
And with this, I would like to call this session to an end. I would like to thank my co-moderator, Dr. Jayesh Lele, who is also the Honorary Secretary General of the Indian Medical Association, for joining us today.